I'm going to be talking to Professor Jason Foster, who is a professor of human resources and labor relations at Athabasca University, about legislation that was introduced today by the UCP government in Alberta to end the teacher strike after almost 3 weeks. So, welcome to the interview, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the act, which is very interesting in its own right, I've interviewed labor leaders a couple of times about this issue, and they keep saying that the invocation of the notwithstanding clause, so that protects the legislation from being taken to court, challenged in court, is a very unique moment. And this government, they say, can't be allowed to get away with it. Has national implications. Why is that?
I think for two reasons. One is it is almost unprecedented. The only other time we saw this in recent history is in 2022 with Doug Ford, who tried to do a very similar thing, but within 4 days backed down due to public resistance and backlash. And then there was a second version way back in 1986, but that was a different time. But the main reason why it's significant is that when you normalize governments just stopping collective bargaining, stopping strikes, and just legislating what's going to happen in workers' collective agreements, is you are undermining the fundamentals of collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is about both parties putting as much pressure on the other party as they possibly can, right? So if you think about the private sector, you go on strike, the employer can't produce their goods or deliver their services. The workers don't have their salary, and so, they're on strike pay. And so both parties are feeling this pressure, which increases their motivation to settle, right? To get a deal. When the government can come in and just legislate and just say, yeah, no, we're ending this, and we're ending this in the favor of the employer, which is the government, you completely break down that dynamic. And so the employer no longer has a reason to bargain. Why would they bargain if they know the government's just going to swoop in and pass legislation and it's all over? And so you break down the whole fundamentals of what is about free collective bargaining in Canada. And that's why I think labor leaders in the labor movement get so worked up about it. And I think it's quite legitimate.
One of the comments I saw today from a teacher on social media was that collective bargaining is really one of the pillars of democracy, and that's why it can't be allowed to be undermined. Would you agree or disagree?
I would totally agree with that. I mean, what the Supreme Court has said is that the freedom of association, which is a really core Section 2 in the Charter of Rights, right? Like really key right. We get to hang out with who we get to hang out with. We get to be a part of what we want to do. We be able to express ourselves. Collective bargaining is intimately tied into that. If you eliminate collective bargaining, you're basically saying you don't get to associate. Right? You don't get to form a collective organization to defend your rights, which leaves individuals, individual workers, individual Canadians at the mercy of those with power. And so, yeah, I do agree completely that it is a cornerstone of democracy to allow free collective bargaining. And quite frankly, the International Labour Organization from the United Nations agrees. This is not a Canadian thing. This is an international thing. It is a fundamental building block of strong democracies.
So in Bill 2, there is a section there, a clause that invokes this notwithstanding clause, overrides and I'm reading from the act, overrides the Charter Section 2 and 7 to 15 of the Alberta Bill of Rights and the Human Rights Act. As I think that's the way it's worded. Why it does it have to be included in the legislation? Is that the official way that you invoke that clause?
Well, if you're going to use the notwithstanding clause, that's how you do it. So they've done it, legally, they've done it appropriately. I think the core of your question, though, is that this is a completely unnecessary and illegitimate way to do this. And the reason I say this is that it basically says it doesn't matter whether we're violating your rights. You don't get to do anything about it, right? You don't get to go to the courts, which is, in a democracy, right? We have the court system, we have the judiciary to decide whether the legislature is doing the appropriate thing or not. And they're overriding that. They're saying, no, you don't get to have that process. And it's an imperfect process. It takes too long. It's too expensive. There's lots of things wrong with it, but it is an important component of democracy. And so when a government just says, nope, you don't get to say, you don't get to criticize what we're doing, you don't get to challenge what we're doing, we're just going to do it whether you like it or not. That's a problem. That's the core problem here, is it's not about this specific strike. It's not about teachers, although it is about teachers, but it's beyond it's bigger than teachers. It is actually a really fundamental piece of our democracy that Danielle Smith and the UCP government today has undermined.
Now, in the act, teachers must cease all strike and lockout activity at once. It legislates the collective agreements, so there's no negotiating anymore. And it binds all of the school boards and about 46,000 teachers. It bars new or continuing strikes and lockout actions. And here's a part that teachers are really upset about from what I can see so far. Penalties are fines up to $500 for individuals, 500,000 for organizations like a union, and per day of violation. That seems incredibly punitive.
Oh, it's excessively punitive. The Labor Relations Code already has penalties in place for illegal strikes. Right, and you could make an argument that they're also overly punitive, but that's a debate for another day. The point being is that they have, by magnitudes, like by exponential magnitudes, they have increased those penalties. And it's obviously intended to make it impossible for the teachers and the teachers union to be able to exercise their democratic rights in response to this bill by making it so financially punitive that it could break them. And that's the intention. And it's way beyond, I think, what a reasonable human being would consider to be a reasonable penalty for defying this act.
One of the reactions I've seen again on social media by teachers is they are now afraid to speak out lest they be come to the attention of the government and be one of those individuals who get fined $500 a day. And is that
I
a legitimate fear?
I completely understand the fear. I mean, I think I would like to reassure those individuals that this act only deals with actions, not words, right? That it only is if you choose to not to go back to work. You still, for now, under this government, have the right to speak your mind. You still have the right to be able to express your opposition to this, to say that you're opposed to this. And so I want to try and assure people that is still okay. And I think you should, because that's important in a democracy to be able to express your opinion. But I completely understand the fear. I understand why because when one right gets crushed, why wouldn't you think that some other rights are also getting crushed? And that's one of the reasons why this is problematic, because it becomes a little bit of a, oh, well, one right doesn't matter. So what about my other right? So my right to association doesn't matter under this government. So what about my right to free speech? I get it. I totally understand the fear.
So according to the act, operations, which I assume we're talking about the school day, have to resume as soon as practicable. When are we talking? A Wednesday, Thursday, Friday next week? What's your take on that?
Well, as the time that you and I are talking, the bill is not yet passed, and so that's a bit hard to know that. My guess is probably Wednesday, because they'll probably pass the bill late tonight. Seems like that's their plan. It'll get royal sent tomorrow, and so yeah, I would assume that they're talking about Wednesday, maybe Thursday, if there's logistical restrictions. So yeah, it'll be before the end of the week if the teachers decide to obey the rule, which, I mean, one of the three options that they have is that they could defy. consequences would be quite large, but we have seen in history that sometimes workers are prepared to do that.
We should point out that late last week, the government tabled a motion in the legislature restricting debate to 1 hour for the first reading, 1 hour for the second reading, 1 hour for the third reading. And then my understanding is that it has to go to the lieutenant governor for royal assent, and then the government proclaims it. Then basically it's the law of the land. Anything that I've missed out?
No, that's precisely it. I mean, I think the only piece that you may have missed is that they also passed a motion allowing them to do more than one reading in a single day. Normally, under the rules, you can't do multiple readings in one day. So that's just kind of part and parcel of saying they want no debate on this bill. They want this bill passed tonight. And I mean, maybe they'll get the lieutenant governor in the office late tonight. That's why I wonder if it might extend to tomorrow morning to be able to get royal assent. But yeah, you've summarized the process well.
Now, there is going to be a pay raise under the legislated agreement. 3% annually, I understand, starting in 2024. So there'll be some back pay. And there's going to be 1,000 new teachers per year for the next 3 years, 1,500 educational assistants. And on the face of it, like, if I was just a regular citizen, not connected, didn't know any teachers, that sort of thing, I might look at this and go, this is a reasonable agreement. They got pay raises, they're around inflation, they got some more teachers. But teachers don't feel that way. Why don't they feel that way?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I appreciate that question. Like, I think the first thing we need to say is that this is exactly the last offer that the government presented, and it got voted on by the teachers, and they rejected it 98%. So this isn't like a divided, union. This is teachers saying, no, we don't like this deal. And I think what it's about is it's not actually about the money. In talking to the teachers that I've talked to and understanding the situation, they would accept that 12% if they got the things that really matter to them. And what really matters is some language around managing class sizes and managing resources in the classroom to deal with classroom complexity. And this government has refused, absolutely refused to negotiate those items. And those are the two biggest priorities for teachers. And so you're right, on the surface, it seems like a pretty decent deal. But I think when you really understand what it is the teachers care about, it's not addressing those issues. And so it's never really been about the money. And that I think is something that the government has fundamentally misunderstood, is that they don't get that it's not really actually about the pay raise. It's about classroom conditions. It's about their working conditions. And that's why they're so angry. It's why they're prepared to do this 3-week strike. It's why we are where we are. The government has not acknowledged that. So I think that's why they rejected that deal when they had it before them, and why today it's still considered an unreasonable deal.
Now, that's interesting because when, the government emails out press releases and so on to journalists all the time, my inbox is full of Alberta releases. But this one had some background information on aggression and complexity in classrooms, which I hadn't heard of before. And so I read through some of the material, and and this almost is grist for another interview, Jason, because it's quite complex and there's a lot to deal with here. But I think we should, because you mentioned it, we should just touch on it. And there's been some concerns in the last few years that aggression against teachers, violence even, has risen quite dramatically inside classrooms. And teachers aren't feel they're not being protected. They don't have the resources to deal with it. Crowding has a lot to do with it. High numbers of class. And the government had a task force, and they got some reports and recommendations, and they're just kind of dealing with that now. But they did seem to, at least in the act and in the release, nod towards recognizing that's a problem and promising to do something about it. What would your take be on all of that?
Well, what I would say in response to that is I remember the 2002 teacher strike, where in that case, instead of imposing the collective agreement, they actually imposed binding arbitration, which is a much more reasonable approach. But the other thing they did at that time is they promised to do a learning commission to study issues in the school system. And yeah, it issued a report, but the government didn't do anything. Nothing came of it, which is part of the reasons why we have this dispute today. And so I guess what my response to that is, yeah, that's an easy promise for a government with a political problem to say today. But in a year or whatever, time that report comes out, what is their motivation and their interest in actually solving the problem at that time? And so I'm very skeptical that those kind of promises ever amount to anything.
Your skepticism is reflected in the comments I'm seeing from teachers that this is the task force they set up, the report they got is really lip service. And without putting some language in the bill, without making some sort of concrete progress and committing concrete resources, that it will just be lip service and it won't make any difference a year from now, 5 years from now. But it sounds like from what you're saying, there's kind of a history of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, this is how governments solve their short-term problems. They become addicted to this kind of legislation because it solves a short-term political problem and it kicks the bigger problem down the road to some other premier, to some other government, and so they're happy to do it. And I think teachers are right to be not just skeptical but angry about this. I mean, not to be too crude about it, but I really do feel like this legislation today was a gigantic middle finger to teachers and their concerns, their legitimate concerns about what's going on in the classroom. And so what it means is that teachers are going to go back to school, whether it be, Wednesday or in a week or whenever it might be. They're going to go back more angry. They're going to go back more resentful, and they're going to go back feeling more disrespected. And that's not good. And so that means there's going to be a bigger problem down the road.
Jason, another set of comments that I've heard is that this government and the Kenny UCP government that preceded it is, bent on union busting. And they see this agreement and the use of the notwithstanding clause as an attempt to break the back of the labor movement in Alberta. And what are your thoughts on that?
I think that this is a signal to something bigger. I mean, since 2019, yes, since 2019, this government has implemented a series of policies and legislation that would be undoubtedly characterized as anti-union. But I think this latest move is a signal to public sector unions. We don't care what you want. We will do what we want. And so, we have licensed practical nurses at AUPE who are close to being in a strike position in the next couple of few weeks. Health Sciences Alberta is going to go into mediation in November. We have lots of outstanding, post-secondaries. There's municipalities. There's lots of outstanding public sector agreements that are still in negotiation. And I think this sends a chill amongst all of them about if you dare stand up for your rights and demand fair treatment, we'll just smack you down like we just smacked down the teachers. Now, I think it's a very chilling message that they're sending today.
Jason, very, very interesting insights as always. Thank you very much for this.
My pleasure as always, anytime.